Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest Free Press Book Club meeting for Jonathan Dyck's graphic novel, Shelterbelts. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll kick things off with a quick round of introductions. My name is Nadya Pankiw, and I am your book club administrator. Also, from the Free Press, we have our arts, life, and food writer, Eva Wasney, joining us as host. We have Chris Hall from McNally Robinson and our author, Jonathan Dyck. Eva, Chris, and I are streaming to you from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 land and the original territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Lakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. In a moment here, I'll pass it off to Chris for an introduction, and then Jonathan will take it away with a reading, followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions, there is a live chat box to the bottom right of the video, and we will get to those questions when we can. After our discussion, I will introduce our November pick. And with that, it's over to you, Chris.
All right. Thank you, Nadya, and good evening, everybody. Tonight, we're here to discuss Shelterbelts, a graphic novel by Jonathan Dyck. Shelterbelts tells a quiet story set in the small rural town of Hespeler, about the lives of its mostly Mennonite residents. There are issues that disrupt the routines of their day. Churches are striving to attract more members. Military recruitment takes over the Remembrance Day ceremony. Questions of Indigenous land rights and the environment appear. There are pacifists and there are activists. I'm not an experienced reader of graphic novels, but the few that I have read make me notice the way they can convey silences. A conventional novel can convey silence, but it has to describe it with words. A graphic novel's wordless frames get much closer to actual silence. And this lends them a greater power to convey things like a character's silent reflection and sometimes moments that we would describe as leaving us speechless. Shelterbelts uses these silences extensively and effectively, tells a very contemplative story in the face of the issues it addresses. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the book from its author, so I will now introduce Jonathan Dyck to read from Shelterbelts.
Thanks so much, Chris. And thank you to the Free Press Book Club for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun, and it's an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen and jump into my presentation. So bear with me. Hey, why are you stopping? Somebody just pulled up. Oh man, I guess we should get out of here. Ugh, I hate that place. Hey, Susie, do you have any road pops left? Yeah, for sure. Can you guys at least wait till we're on a country road? Bzz. Don't stay too late. You promised the girls you'd read them some Narnia before bed tonight. Kind of stuck, TBH. Well, it never hurts to pray about it. Smiley face. Just write the sermon you needed to hear before you met me. Heart, 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 heart. You got this, babe. XO. Yawn. Someone left this bread on the porch. Oh, that must be from Karen at church, Rebecca's mom. I know who Karen is, Dad. That woman is so friggin' nice. I was just thinking about taking a break. Want to play some darts? You're still not done your sermon? So, what are you preaching on tomorrow? Well, the text is from 1 Peter, so I was thinking I'm going to speak about being called out. You got called out? Oh, no, not in that sense. The Greek word used for the early church, ecclesia, it literally means those who are called out, as in called out of darkness and into light. Right. We tend to focus on what we're being called out of, but it's really about what we're being called into. I feel like I've heard this one before. Coming tomorrow? We'll see. Night, Dad. One of the great myths of the modern age is that we are in control of our own lives. But deep down, everyone knows the truth. We're all trapped. You can see it all around you. People trying to escape this reality with drugs and alcohol, promiscuity and sexual experimentation. The list goes on and on. Maybe it's that brand new truck you've been saving for, or that promotion at work, or that family vacation at Disney World. But you and I know that none of these things, nothing in this world will free us. Only God has the power to do that, and he did by sending his son Jesus. Every blessing, every temptation is an invitation from God to grow closer to him. My wife, our kids, this wonderful community, the best parts of my life came when I chose to follow his will and not my own. Hey, Dad, my shift ended early, so I went for a walk nearby. I'm at the corner of Spruce and Poplar Ave. No rush. I mean, it's residential, it's a weeknight, and there's literally no one outside right now. Hey! Well, it looks like our church just lost another family. It was over the LGBTQ issue. Sorry, I know issue isn't the right word. Did they speak to you directly about it? They talked to several people who all suggested they talk to me. There was a visioning meeting a few weeks ago where someone said we should think about being more explicit in our language. More welcoming to people like your gay daughter? Yes. And then there was that hymn we sang on Sunday. Oh yeah, the one with the line about loving all genders. And the very obvious rainbow metaphor. Yeah. Kathy, Mrs. Neufeld, called this afternoon to let me know. She was in my office earlier this week and things got a bit heated. I suppose it was her last resort. She said she's certain about where she stands on the issue and just as certain about what the Bible says. I'm guessing it's the only book she's ever read. Well, it's an opinion she's held for a long time. I told her that we have a spectrum of views at the church, but we've all agreed that we can still worship together, that there's enough common ground elsewhere. Okay, let's do it tomorrow. Sorry I had to cancel. Can't wait to catch up. XOXO. At the end of the day, I'm still their pastor, and I have to balance that with my own personal views. Sounds like you've already decided that you're giving up. You don't need to develop it all at once, especially as more of this farmland turns commercial. The value will just keep climbing. The new skate park is our first priority, but we've also been dreaming about using this area for a coffee shop and potential business partnerships. Well, the land's not cheap, and those trees will need to go if you want direct access to the highway. Tap, tap. I'll be meeting with the rest of the pastoral team to talk funding strategy, but we don't want to rush into anything. Thanks to you, the church is really growing. I think God is trying to tell us something. This might be the right time to expand. If we aren't growing, we're stagnating. But it's not just about numbers. It's also spiritual. All I'm saying is you'll need to act fast if you're serious about it. We'll take some time to discern and pray. See you Sunday. Screech! Goddamn whitetails. You're not even supposed to be here. Hey, Jake? Yeah, please go ahead and start on the paperwork. I'm sure I'll be able to bring everybody on board. There is no time to waste when it comes to outreach. God is giving us this opportunity to expand for a reason. So, you guys want to cruise around again tonight? I heard there's going to be a fire down at the gravel pits. I'm working at the gas bar tonight, so maybe after I can pick you up. That sounds a bit too late for me. What, you got to be up for church or something tomorrow? Yeah, right. It would suck to be a pastor's kid. At least it's not at one of those really conservative churches, like where the women aren't allowed to speak. I like your dad. Seems like an okay guy. Flick. Yeah, he tries to be, I guess. Hey, don't your parents go to one of those churches? Shut up. I better get back to work. Maybe see you later. And that's where we will end it. So I will stop sharing my screen here. And back to you.
That was great. And I think it's interesting just to see your process in doing a book reading of a graphic novel and how different it might be than doing a reading of your typical kind of full written novel. And I want to get into some of your process and the behind the scenes of creating the book, but maybe we should start with some of the themes. And I'm interested to hear you speak about why you wanted to open the book in the vignette that you did, and why that was where you wanted to read from tonight.
Well, I like that the opening sort of touches on a number of themes that are going to become important. But it is one of the more cinematic moments in the book too, and I just love drawing it. Honestly, like for me, the parking lot is the central hub of a small town. It's where people hang out, and yeah, the question of like cruising Main Street on the weekend, that was a live question for me in high school. But I also, particularly those first few panels, I had a little fun with that when I was drawing it, and I don't know if it's pretty subtle. It's a bit of a stretch, but when I drew those sort of vertical lines on the parking lot, I was imagining those as abstract tree shapes. So I thought, I'm going to start this with a shelter belt. But the other reason I start there is because the prologue actually came to towards the end of the editing process of the book. But the first story, Truth, that I began with was the first story I wrote. And it was a story I wrote, or a story I drew before I really knew what this was going to be. It was something that particularly the issue of around LGBTQ inclusion in Mennonite churches was something I was kind of grappling with, and I wanted to essentially put it in some people's faces. Yeah, so that's more or less why I started there. Also the question, like, because there is also a shelter belt sort of visible in that first story, and it sets up the sort of contrast between these two churches. Seems like a good way to lay the groundwork for later on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the contrast between those two churches is interesting because on one hand you have this kind of mega church that is progressing in these real like physical ways. Their attendance is growing, their congregations are growing, they're expanding beyond their borders and things like that. But then socially, they're not progressing in the same ways as this kind of older church that is maybe has waning attendance and that kind of thing. So, and I think that sets up, like you said, a lot of the discussion that comes throughout the book of these like grappling with progress and conservatism and that and history and that kind of thing. And maybe if you could talk about kind of your own background and your own experience in Mennonite churches, in Mennonite communities.
Yeah. I grew up in Winkler, Manitoba, which is, a predominantly Mennonite city. It's grown a lot since I moved to Winnipeg. But I was a pastor's kid. So the pastor theme is it's there for a reason. And I felt that throughout my growing up years, I didn't really have a clear handle on what being Mennonite was exactly. It was always kind of vague, despite the fact that my dad pastored a Mennonite church. And that church ended up being something I really grew to appreciate over the years, particularly as I thought about how I related to the rest of the community and how that church sort of positioned itself in relation to the community. It was a fairly liberal church. And I think that, from the get-go, that was something I wanted to represent, because that's often not what gets represented in, treatments of the church. To me, the vast range of church communities and various, ethical positions that they take, it's a huge range, and it really encompasses, all the political positions that you can think of. At the same time, there's always internal divides. There's always debates going on, and I think that complexity has always been very interesting to me, and it does disrupt some of our understandings of what liberal and conservative mean. It's all relative, and in a space like a more kind of conservative small town, what seems somewhat conservative in another space might seem quite liberal. So I wanted to hint at some of that.
Certainly. And that's something that I took away from it as well. You do a really good job of showing kind of the gray in between these things that are often viewed from the outside as black and white. And the character of Karen Peters really comes to mind when I think about that, and how you show her as a librarian who in her job and in her life is kind of seen, you frame her as an activist of sorts. And then from her daughter Rebecca's point of view, she is maybe a little bit stuck in her ways and not as progressive as she would like. So I'm curious why that kind of nuance and context for these characters was so important to you.
In many ways, I was just kind of reflecting people I knew, and some conversations and debates that I've experienced and been part of. But I also, I knew that my readers were going to be Mennonites, among others. But I like to think of it as high risk, high reward, because you're not going to get readers who are much more engaged than those who feel they're being represented in some way. And that's a scary thing. I've done readings in Winkler and in Morden and Altona and in Steinbach. And I think for the most part, the response that I've been receiving has been mostly appreciation for showing that complexity. And the books I really appreciate have also been ones that try to show some of that gray and to dwell in some of the more ambivalent positions.
And you touch on so many different topics from so many different angles throughout the book. I'm curious how you kind of settled on which topics you wanted to include in the novel.
Yeah, the way that I originally conceived this series of stories, and I did initially write these as separate stories that were interconnected. It was later on that I kind of went back and tried to knit them together a bit more cohesively, and added, I added an extra story at that point in the process. I also added the epilogue and prologue. But initially, when I was thinking of this cycle of stories, I was organizing the stories into groups of three. And the first set of stories, I sort of identified three themes that I thought were really kind of integral to understanding Mennonite consciousness in Manitoba. One was the theme of peace. So the first three stories, to some extent, all either bring up particular tensions or conflicts, whether it's like inclusion and exclusion in the church, or over Remembrance Day ceremony stuff, or it's discussion around residential schools. Those stories all bring up issues related to peace, even if indirectly. The second set of stories were all about land, even though the whole book is really about land and about peace and about the third category, which is faith. But land, peace, and faith were the three major sort of themes I wanted to think about and work through.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, because you described earlier not really having a sense of what it was to be Mennonite. And I'm curious if, like, in the process of writing this book, if you've come to a clearer understanding, or if you have some kind of answer for yourself.
Yeah, I as I was working on the book, I was doing actually a fair bit of research into Mennonite history. And I was also doing some research particularly around Mennonite settlement in southern Manitoba. And that definitely informed, the topics I thought I wanted to promote in the book. And little, hiding little Easter eggs in various parts of the book, that things that, certain people might not pick up on. Some Mennonites might pick up on, some won't. Certain generations won't pick up on. But yeah, little treats for everybody, basically. But I think as I learned a bit more about that history and how Mennonite identity, particularly in Manitoba, is so interwoven with the history of settlement, and particularly block settlement, and how that's part of the reason why Mennonites initially were attracted to Manitoba, because they had that opportunity and ability. And thinking about Indigenous displacement as a result of that. I think that I don't have a straightforward answer to what it means to be Mennonite, but I think of this book as my opportunity to kind of ask the question and kind of push at some of the more sensitive spots for some Mennonites. There are lots of Mennonites of color around the world, and even here in Winnipeg, but we have such a strong fixation here on this ethnic or cultural identity of being Mennonite that we miss that population sometimes in conversation. And I didn't really draw that much attention to that aspect, but certainly that is a tension that I am interested in.
Mm-hmm. And just back to the Easter eggs, what are some of the Easter eggs you wanted to include?
Oh, well, there's a character named Pete. He's a high school teacher, history teacher, modeled after one of my own. And he does, not to give any spoilers, but he's got some old protest songs from the Bush era. And you see him whipping out his guitar one day, opening up his guitar case, and the stickers on that guitar case are, it's a pretty, there's some symbols in there that some people might recognize. There's also, things like Hespeler, even the name of this town, I consider a bit of an Easter egg because for those who know a little bit about Manitoba's history and the history of Mennonite settlement, Hespeler is the name of the German immigration agent who Canada sent to recruit Mennonites from Russia. But like Winkler, which is not named for a Mennonite or not translated from a German town name, it's something that kind of evokes this homage to a founder or to somebody who helped them along the way.
Neat. You mentioned music, and I was interested to see how you kind of included some lyrics and things like that. There's some John K. Samson in there, and you've got Bible verses and things like that. How did you pick which kind of like cultural references you wanted to include, and why were they important to you?
Yeah, the music stuff was really fun to include. Initially, there was actually a Bob Dylan song included, but we couldn't get the rights to it. So the protest song that Pete sings, we had to find a plan B. And luckily, my friend Bucky Dreger, who is a member of the group Royal Canoe, we were classmates together at one point, and he had this old protest song called Bombs, and he was happy to let me use it, kind of in a cheeky moment. The Weaker Than song that I included, I actually, that to me, that song, a favorite song, my favorite chords, there's parts of it that just really resonated with me. And I mean, I live in Winnipeg, but I still have family in Winkler, and I make the trip back and forth all the time. So including some characters who live in the city, and just showcasing a little bit of it was important to me. I felt like I got to kind of spread my wings a little in those moments and capture a bit of like kind of contemporary life here. And I felt that too, that including Weaker Than's in a graphic novel about Manitoba. I mean, if I don't do it, someone else is going to. So I was really excited to include that. And I know John a little bit. So he gave me his blessing, and I was happy to support the project in that way. But I actually did I had a lot of music that I was listening to while I worked on this as well. And I ended up making a Shelterbelts themed playlist when the book first came out. So there's even more.
That's great. We can get into a little bit of the process. I'm gonna jump to a reader question though that we had submitted that kind of touches on the stuff we've been talking about. Does Jonathan have any broad comments or guidelines for writing your culture, which he does so well in Shelterbelts?
Well, that's a great question. That's something I thought about a lot too. And I was also very very careful around representing other cultures. And so, both for Mennonite culture and some of the others represented in the book, like the Métis character, I did seek out other readers. I certainly feel like I have some license to, I don't know, give the gears to like some of the Mennonite characters. And yet, because I was writing about so many, I could spread that out, and I could show, part of the reason the book's so sprawling and so full of characters is because I didn't want, I wanted to spread out some of the character traits that I associated with certain people or certain aspects of our culture. So I do, I do attribute a lot of that to the form of the book. But ultimately, I think having readers and, sometimes people would call me on certain things, or, I get told, people wouldn't actually say this. So, yeah.
Neat. And I really appreciated your kind of character key at the beginning. I found myself referring back to that quite a bit. So that was like just a very handy inclusion. And so talking about the process of putting a graphic novel together, curious how long it took you to put Shelterbelts together, and kind of like how you went about doing it. Did the writing come first? Did you do a lot of storyboarding? How did it kind of come together for you?
It was a process that started. I had the name of the series first. Like I was I'd learned a bit about shelterbelt planting in southern Manitoba, and particularly like from my own family history. I grew up on a farm where there were shelterbelts, and um, it was a bit of an aha moment for me, because I learned that, I mean, it wasn't even something I learned exactly. I just hadn't really thought about it before. But all those rows of trees, they were all planted by people. This was a prairie grassland before it was agricultural territory. And just thinking about the landscape in that way kind of helped me start to see it a little differently. And I thought that it would be, a useful kind of concept or metaphor for a series of stories. But the first story kind of came about when I realized I've been journaling since I was in high school, and I started actually doing little cartoons in my journals, like little comics, to capture certain conversations. And it was kind of when I realized I could pull some of those little nuggets out, and I could recontextualize them. I could, fictionalize certain parts. Those were kind of the building blocks. And the first page in the book that I actually drew wasn't meant to be part of a story necessarily. It was the page near the beginning of the church service. I just wanted to draw the aesthetics of a Mennonite church service, and create a nice page design. So that came first. So in that way, images came first, but eventually once I had to actually get working, I would type out some dialogue, or I'd loosely kind of frame a storyline. And then I have several notebooks where I would thumbnail every page and think about the grid that I was using.
Mm-hmm. And then sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, back to the first part of your question. The first story was written, I think in November 2018. So
Okay.
a little while ago.
Mm-hmm. But still seems quick, because there's so much like drawing that you have to do to create a book like this. Like, there's a lot of labor that you're putting in to create a graphic novel. Are you a fairly fast drawer?
No. I mean, I am when I'm loose about it. Like I have lots of sketchbooks, and if I'm drawing with a pencil, or I'm like doing observational drawing or stuff or things like that, I can be fairly quick. With this process, honestly, was fairly agonizing. Not to like overstate it, but I drew these all on 11 by 17 pages. And everything in the book is hand drawn. Like I kind of committed before I knew how long the book was going to be. I committed to a certain kind of format and template, and I, part of the impetus behind those first few stories was also just to like explore, narrative comics and try to get better at storytelling. And of course, over time I did, and I was able to go back and edit some of these earlier stories, but. Yeah, I some of those decisions that I made early on, I came to regret later. The nice thing about working with such a basic grid structure is I could move panels around when I needed to. But I also had the sense, like my publisher, when we were first talking about this book, and they decided to publish it, they told me they were going to promote it as the first Mennonite graphic novel, which I didn't love that. I was like, oh, I'm sure there's been other ones. Come on. That seems a little self-aggrandizing or something. But then I thought, okay, if that's how they're gonna sell this thing, I'm gonna go all out, and I'm gonna like whoever follows after me, they have to know that they have to feel some pressure to handwrite every bit of text, or let that go.
I'm gonna set the bar really high.
Yeah.
Why not? That's really interesting to hear kind of how it came together in your editing process and stuff. As a reader, I've read a couple of graphic novels previously, but not for a long time. And I was just surprised how quickly I moved through the book and how quickly things flowed. But at the same time, I feel like I was able to maybe hold on to more information because of the nature of the illustrations, and maybe get a bit of a deeper, as Chris was talking about in his introduction, kind of a deeper understanding of the characters and kind of their lives. And I'm curious how you decided when you needed descriptions of things and dialogue to move the story along, and when you were able to kind of let the illustrations stand alone and do some showing instead of telling.
It was a tricky process, partly because I decided, apart from a few panels, I think early on in the book, there's really no interior dialogue or monologue. I decided to write all these characters without kind of a window into their interiority. Whereas, in prose fiction, often you get a lot of it. And that meant I had to kind of evoke certain things through facial expressions, through images of landscape and contemplation. But ultimately, the wordless panels were kind of my favorite things to draw. And what I was trying to do throughout the writing and drawing process was think about moments where I wanted to slow the reader down. And I think that an arresting illustration can do that. I'm guessing you noticed that I think one review that I read said that I clearly most enjoy drawing organic shapes and like bits of nature, and those were instances where I did feel like I could kind of be a little self-indulgent. And yeah, I did. After my first draft of all these stories was done, I did receive a grant and was able to hire an editor who did an amazing job helping me sort of work at some of the narrative consistency. So she had actually never read a graphic novel before, but she had edited novels, and I said, I feel pretty confident in terms of kind of the comic side of things, but if you can help me with some of the the flow of dialogue and narrative structure, that would be great. Yeah.
Interesting. And I have a reader question that also kind of touches on process and things like that. So it goes, the title Shelterbelts is such an appropriate analogy for the stories contained in the book. The book cover is beautiful and the drawings are so well done. The vignettes presented seem to be like short stories. I'm wondering if using this format presented challenges to the author and illustrator.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. It did pose challenges, some of which I've already talked about. I mean, I didn't really want to create dramatic stories. I did initially, just plan on doing these as vignettes. So thinking in terms of the larger narrative structure was something I had to work at later on, and it made the editing process a lot more grueling than it might have been otherwise. But yeah, particularly the grid and the framing became both a blessing and a curse as I was working on it. And one of the reasons I decided that Shelterbelts was such a useful metaphor was because they are what make the gridded farmland in the prairies visible. So it's more than, it's not just a metaphor, it's also a structuring device. It's also something that, is meant to at least draw some attention to the grid of the page. There's a connection there. It's why I also chose to, the Shelterbelts is a framing device for the cover, just like they're framing each of the pages. So I'm hoping that some of those formal decisions can kind of come through in the content of the stories as well.
It's so interesting to hear that, like, through this medium, you're able to add that much meaning, even to just the shape of the pages, right? It all harkens back to the theme of the book, which is pretty amazing. And I'm going to get through a couple of other reader questions, and then maybe, I'm not sure, Nadya, if there's anybody that's giving us questions in the chat or anything like that, but you can let me know.
Everyone's saying quiet. I feel, hey readers, if you hear this, type away, ask your questions. We're ready to answer.
Please. So another reader question we got, and this kind of, you did touch on this kind of in talking about doing readings in Winkler and some of those communities. This reader says, back in 1984, I was visiting Winkler and was able to buy a copy of The Salvation of Jacques Siemens. Am I saying that correctly?
Josh Siemens.
Gosh, yeah, totally wrong. Sorry. By Armin Wiebe from the Winkler Bible Bookshop, but they kept it under the counter. What has been the reception of Shelterbelts in Winkler?
Oh my gosh, that's an awesome story. I'm so thrilled that Winkler Bible Bookshop carried a copies of Josh Siemens under the desk. I actually read that book for the first time a couple years ago, and whoa, has anyone else here read it?
I haven't.
Okay, I don't have much command of Low German, and a lot of the humor of The Salvation of Josh Siemens is contained in the Low German, but it's still hilarious even if you don't get all the jokes. It is raunchy, and as I worked on this and read some more Mennonite literature, I realized that the kinds of risks that I thought I was taking have all been taken before. That being said, Winkler is a different place now than it was in the 80s. The Bible Bookshop, I'm pretty sure either it barely exists or it doesn't exist now. It's interesting. I feel like somewhat out of touch with the place, despite my frequent back and forth to and from. But I will say that the reason I did a reading in Winkler and Morden, close to the publication of the book, was because the branch librarian, immediately reached out to me and asked me to come and do it. And certainly people from family and friends, people in my parents' church community have been very, very supportive. There's a few retired teachers at the high school who substitute occasionally and know me, and they pass this book to students. I know that it's in the school library, but other than that, I haven't heard a whole lot from those places. But in the wider Mennonite community, there's been nothing but positive kind of affirmation. So
that's great. Sorry.
Our call at work. Yes, we do have a question. Jonathan, you spoke about having an editor come on board to help with the dialogue, and you said you felt quite confident about most of your drawings. Our reader is wondering what percentage of your drawings made it into the novel, and did you have to edit images in and out?
Yeah, there's definitely there are a few pages that didn't make it in. There are some panels that I had to cut. I think the process of editing was really a big learning experience for me. And I was game, once we started working together, and like I said, slash and burn. It also meant I would, add a page here and there to spread something out. Like sometimes the narratives were too dense. Sometimes there was too much dialogue all in one place. And I did, once it's going to be a book, you might as well add another page. Like, especially when it's a graphic novel. Some graphic novels are, have an incredible density to them. There's dialogue in every panel. But I did feel like with something like this, having those more spacious scenes and moments was important. I also just, as I went along, I enjoyed them more and more.
That's great. And we had another question from a reader, and this is maybe a good kind of thing to close on, but and I'll tie it into something I was interested in, because you've done a lot of standalone illustrations and had a lot of your work published in kind of short form. When did you decide that you wanted to dive into a graphic novel, like full length?
I didn't really know if I wanted to. I'd known I wanted to do a graphic novel probably since I read Louis Riel by Chester Brown. But it would take another 10 years before I felt like I could actually pull one off. And there was a moment, I was living in Montreal for a little while, and someone who wasn't Mennonite but knew some expats from Manitoba encouraged me to read Swing Low by Miriam Toews. And I'd read A Complicated Kindness maybe 10 years before that. And when I read Swing Low, it shook me to the core. It's just a beautiful and daring book. But it made me feel kind of a bit of a pull back home to Manitoba. And it planted this seed. And that seed was that some of the stories that I felt, were mine to tell, some of the stories that I wanted to tell weren't going to be possible for me to tell elsewhere. I had to come back. So part of it was coming here and realizing like, yes, I could do this here. And then pulling some of those threads together. But ultimately it had a lot to do with coming back to Manitoba.
I think that's, sorry, I think.
Is that it?
I have one more. I think that's a great segue into this last, we'll call it the last one, the last reader question. You're kind of speaking about writing and creating what you know, and knowing the audience that will be able to resonate with that the best. This reader has asked, do you have any advice for readers who are new to graphic novels, or how you can get the most out of the text and images?
Wow. Yeah, great question. I actually am currently teaching a course in comics at CMU. It's in the English department there. And my favorite thing to teach, and what I tell everyone they need to read, is Mouse. It's probably the canonical graphic novel. Most people read it by now. A lot of people read it in high school, but I've learned so much from that book, and particularly in the way that Art Spiegelman, gets the most out of his panels and page designs. He really doesn't waste any space, but he's also planting little clues throughout. For me, the most important thing about graphic novels are the images. So I think, finding attractive images is part of it. Finding books that just, are beautiful objects. That's something that's always drawn me to this particular medium. But yeah, sitting with the images and trying to read them as closely as you're reading the text, I think is key.
May I sneak in one very quick one?
Yeah.
Just curious what you're currently working on, and if you have any other novels in the works or in your brain.
Yeah, I'm working on a few things. One of them is a larger graphic novel-esque project. It's actually graphic memoir. And it is, I consider it a bit of a sequel of sorts to Shelterbelts, even though it's not fiction. It is about Mennonite history, and it is about kind of settlement in Manitoba. So some of that research I was referring to earlier while I worked on Shelterbelts was kind of in preparation for that other project. So yeah, I hope I finish it one day. It's it's one of these kind of fantasy projects. I've got about 50 pages drawn, but it's a beast of a thing, and yeah, that's where I'm putting my my energy for personal work right now.
Wonderful. Thanks.
All right, well then, I think that will do it for tonight. Thank you all to everyone on our panel for the discussion, and thank you to everyone who has tuned in tonight. If you didn't get your copy in time, McNally Robinson has lots of copies of Shelterbelts on hand, and you can, of course, continue to watch this YouTube live. Our November book is called The Russian Daughter by Sarah Clausen, who's also from Winnipeg. Our meeting for The Russian Daughter will take place right here on our YouTube channel on Tuesday, November 28th at 7 p.m. Our meeting will feature Sarah Clausen along with my Free Press colleague, Ariel Gordon, and our friends from McNally Robinson. Thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight, and thank you for reading along. We'll see you soon.